Bene, ben ritrovate, ben ritrovati. Iniziamo questa mattinata, questa seconda giornata congressuale. Ieri abbiamo avuto una giornata impegnativa ma ricca di spunti e ricca anche di conclusioni alla fine. Oggi abbiamo una giornata altrettanto importante e qui vicino a me Sir Marmot, che insomma è una presenza più che gradita ma che abbiamo corteggiato, e di questo dobbiamo ringraziare il professor Costa che ci ha dato i contatti e lo ha convinto a venire a vedere la nostra esperienza, appunto la Marmot City. E quindi io darei immediatamente la parola al professor Costa per presentare Sir Marmot e ascoltare la lezione magistrale.
Bene, è un grande piacere inquadrare l'esperienza di Trieste dentro il quadro più generale degli sforzi che sono in corso per la lotta alle disuguaglianze di salute. È stato coniato in giro per il mondo il concetto di Marmot City come città che in qualche modo riescono a mettere in pratica i principi e gli obiettivi che le varie revisioni che il professor Marmot ha condotto nel passato sui temi delle disuguaglianze di salute hanno permesso. Marmot è stato protagonista di numerose revisioni dei fatti, come nascono le disuguaglianze, di quali sono le spiegazioni, dalle spiegazioni di quali sono le azioni per contrastarle e quindi di chi ha la responsabilità di contrastare queste azioni, sia a livello globale, come vedete la revisione fatta per l'Organizzazione Mondiale della Sanità nella commissione globale che ha pubblicato i suoi risultati nel 2009, sia a livello europeo, vedete questa revisione a livello europeo che è stata pubblicata nel 2014, poi ci ha accompagnati nelle revisioni che abbiamo fatto in Italia, la più recente è quella pubblicata e presentata dalla ministra Lorenzin il 1° dicembre, e ci ha accompagnati anche a livello locale, nel senso che Torino è stata un po' la prima Marmot City che ha fatto questa revisione, si è fatto l'esame di coscienza di quanto siano importanti le disuguaglianze nella città e di come nascono e di come si possono contrastare. Trieste probabilmente potremmo metterla ancora prima di Torino, perché Trieste ci sta presentando i risultati, non solo l'analisi di una revisione. E le cose che discutiamo, che abbiamo discusso ieri e che si discutono stamattina col professor Marmot sono importanti perché a livello europeo, proprio la settimana prossima, 25 rappresentanti dei ministeri della sanità dell'Europa si troveranno a dar l'avvio a una nuova joint action sulle disuguaglianze di salute. Si chiama Health Equity Europe, svegliati Europa, per l'equità nella salute. Il professor Marmot sarà là a fare anche l'introduzione di questa il kick-off di questa nuova joint action e molti paesi europei, tutti i paesi europei praticamente sono rappresentati in joint action e proveranno a fare con questa joint action significativi passi avanti per cambiare la situazione. E i risultati di Trieste saranno estremamente utili per questo scopo, quindi noi faremo in modo che vengano valorizzati per questo scopo. A livello italiano, qua si è rovesciata, non si sa perché, però circa un centinaio di stakeholder e di decisori a livello italiano, alcuni erano seduti al tavolo della tavola rotonda ieri qua, si stanno impegnando a usare i risultati di questa revisione italiana per fare un piano italiano di contrasto delle disuguaglianze. A livello torinese più di 50 decisori e stakeholder sono stati ingaggiati in un esercizio di scelta di priorità per far partire dei programmi, e un paio di questi programmi riguardano esattamente qualcosa di molto simile alle microaree e li vedremo in azione nei prossimi mesi. Trieste si aggiunge in questo, e probabilmente si aggiunge con un particolare, si aggiunge non per presentare dei dati, ma per presentare già delle cose realizzate, dei risultati. Per cui Trieste arriva come Marmot City esattamente già presentando dei risultati. Allora, è in questo quadro che sono molto lieto di presentare la lettura che ci farà Michael Marmot per ritornare a dare uno sguardo globale a quanto sono importanti le disuguaglianze di salute, come nascono, come si possono contrastare e chi ne è responsabile per fare la differenza. Michael. Ci dà la presentazione.
Thank you, Giuseppe. It is always a great pleasure for me to be in Italy, and especially when I hear words like Marmot City in Trieste. It's an especial pleasure. Could I have the slide up there? There we go. So I'm going to talk about, as the title says, social justice, health equity, and community action. My book, The Health Gap, I start with the phrase, why treat people and send them back to the conditions that made them sick? It's what I say to doctors, to the health system, why treat people and send them back to the conditions that made them sick? The Italian translation, only the Italians would have me on the cover doing that. At the Trento, I noticed there's a Trento street in Trieste, but at the Trento Festival of Economics last year, the theme was La salute disuguale. And I had quite forgotten that that was the theme of the festival. They had invited me to come and speak. And when I got there and I saw these signs saying La salute disuguale, and I thought, that's familiar. And then there was a cardboard cutout of me. So I had to have a photo taken next to the cardboard cutout. And I messaged it, what do you call it, SMS. I sent it to my children. And one of my sons came back and says, I think the cutout looks better than the original. That's why you have children. I'm indulging myself, but I'm indulging myself for a reason. This idea of the importance of the social determinants of health is taking off. Luca Di Fiore tweeted this. A crossword in La Repubblica, 146 down, British physician, founder of social epidemiology. There it is. I'm going to put that on my curriculum vitae. Italian crossword puzzle, a clue in an Italian. I mean, what better marker of esteem can there be? Apart from Trieste being a Marmot city, maybe that beats that. And the Japanese translation of my book, the Korean translation, and this is real indulgence. I looked at my diary recently at the different meetings that I'd been asked to come and talk about social determinants of health. Internal medicine, cardiology, respiratory, mental illness, obstetrics, cancer, surgery, pediatrics, child development, urban renewal, violence, inclusion, health, psychosomatic violence and crime, vegetables. I was even asked to go and talk to classicists at the University of Edinburgh about honour in the ancient world. What do I know about honour in the ancient world? I read Homer so I could prepare for the meeting about Odysseus. And public health. my general message, so that's my indulgence, to make the point that these ideas are taking off. My general message is that health follows the social gradient, and I'm looking here at mental illness, the richest, the poorest, the proportion of people assessed as at risk of mental illness, and what you see is the poorer, the higher the risk. I didn't choose mental illness because I knew we were meeting in this building, but I chose it to make the point that whether you're looking at physical illness or mental illness, we have social inequalities, but it's not confined to poor health for the poor. The lower you are in the hierarchy, the higher the risk. We've been monitoring what's been happening to health inequalities in England. It's important to make reports, but then it's important to see what's going on. And last July, we published this. From 2006 to 2010, for women, life expectancy had been increasing 0.24 of a year every year, and for men, 0.3 of a year every year. That's pretty amazing. From 1921 to 2011, 90 years, life expectancy had been increasing about 1 year every 4 years. For 90 years. 1 year every 4 years is really rapid. And Italy, much the same. And then, 2011, this 90-year progression of improvement in life expectancy slowed down dramatically. Just about level. That's really dramatic. And of course, this was almost a symptom of your political viewpoint. I try and argue that I'm not political, by which I mean party political, but people supporting a right-wing government said that this could not possibly be due to anything the government has done. It must be influenza, obesity, an artifact. And people critical of what the government's been doing said, austerity, cuts in funding to social care, cuts in funding to the health service. The first question I was asked when we did this was, but it's got to slow down sometime. We can't keep increasing 1 year every 4 years forever. Well, we looked at what's been happening across Europe. The light color is 2006 to 2010. For some reason or another, we didn't have Italy in here. I apologize. But 2006 to 2010, life expectancy was increasing for all these countries, and the United Kingdom was about the middle of the range. And then 2011 to 2015, there was slowdown in almost every country. And that would be consistent with the effect of the global financial crisis and policies of austerity that were put in place in the wake of the global financial crisis. But in the United Kingdom, this is males, we were second bottom. And females, we were bottom. So it's not the case that we had achieved peak life expectancy and it has to level off sometime, because every other European country was increasing more rapidly than we were. There was a general slowdown, but it was most marked in the UK. And it relates to the question, can you do anything about these health inequalities? I stress, I'm not arguing from a party political viewpoint. I'm looking at the evidence. The new Labour government in Britain did have a strategy to reduce health inequalities. Is there any evidence that it worked? Colleagues in the University of Liverpool, and this is very relevant to micro areas, not quite micro, but they looked at the poorest 20% of local authorities and compared it with the rest. So, this is the annual difference in life expectancy in months. In the period 1983 to 2003, the gap in life expectancy between the poorest 20% of local authorities and the rest was increasing for men and for women. The new Labour government came in 1997, but it took a while to have a strategy and put it in place. And what the data showed was that during that period of their strategy, the life expectancy gap between the poorest 20% of local authorities and the rest narrowed. Health inequalities got smaller. The Labour government got thrown out. A Conservative-led coalition came in. They ditched the strategy, and life expectancy began to increase again. The life expectancy gap began to increase again. It's not proof, but it is consistent with saying what the government does can really make a difference to the magnitude of health inequalities. It's consistent, and I've been more on the fence here. I was asked by the BBC 3 times, is that slowdown due to austerity? And I said, the reduction in social care spending and the failure of NHS spending to rise in line with inflation will have an adverse impact on the quality of life of older people. And I think it urgent to investigate whether it's affecting the length of life of older people. And the BBC reporter said, is austerity killing people? And I went through my careful academic formulation. Well, we don't know. Some of my colleagues think austerity is killing people. And I think it's important to try and figure out if that's the case. In thinking about what was going on in Britain, the slowdown in life expectancy, and the fact that Britain is becoming like the United States, not only have we voted Brexit, but in fact the New York Times did a piece a couple of weeks ago and said Britain is becoming like the United States. Austerity has led to erosion of the welfare state. Does this represent our future? Anne Case and Angus Deaton received a lot of attention for this paper that they published, looking at mortality in men and women aged 45 to 54. Mortality from 1990 to 2012, coming down in France, Germany, the UK, Canada, Australia, Sweden. Big differences between France and Sweden, but coming down in all of them, as it was in US Hispanics. And there's US non-Hispanic whites. In white Americans, mortality going up. And the causes of this rise, Number one, poisonings due to drugs and alcohol. Number two, suicide. Number three, alcoholic liver disease. And then, of course, violent deaths. These are not healthcare issues. Well, the drug poisoning is because of overprescription of opioids, but these are not primarily healthcare issues. They are what Anne Case and Angus Deaton called deaths of despair. And I don't need to remind you that that rise was steeper the fewer the years of education. And those very same people are the Trump voters. They have a choice: kill themselves or vote for Trump, who nearly looked like he was going to kill the rest of us. But I'm not party political. But I am upset. And life expectancy declined in the US 2 years in a row. Unintentional injuries, 2016, 2014, 2015, 2016 rising, and unintentional injuries include accidental drug overdose, 63,600 deaths last year. If you add to that 32,000 deaths from firearms, from guns, that's 100,000 deaths that shouldn't occur, that really should not occur. And this is what's been happening to life expectancy at age 50. For men, by year of birth. Okay, subtle. People who are born in 1920 will be 50 in 1970. People who are born in 1950 will be 50 in 2000. And this is deciles of income. The poorest 10% of income, these are men, very small rise in life expectancy. The next 10%, slightly bigger rise, and so on. So the gradient is getting steeper. The inequalities are getting bigger. The richer you are, the greater the increase. That's men. Now, I don't want to spoil your Friday. You've got a whole day ahead, and I don't want to upset you so early in the morning. But are you feeling strong? Are you ready for the next slide? This is women. Oh my goodness. The poorest 10% have a fall in life expectancy. This next 10% have a fall in life expectancy. The next 10% have a fall in life expectancy. The bottom 30% of the income distribution, life expectancy is going down. This is appalling. And the inequalities are getting much bigger. The social gradient is getting steeper. Is this our future? I guess in Italy, you're not entirely clear what your future is. You can't figure out what kind of government you have. Neither can the government figure out what kind of government you've got. But I'm not political. And looking at the US, this is from UNICEF report card 14, neonatal mortality, suicide 0 to 19, mental health 11 to 15-year-olds, drunkenness in 11 to 15, and fertility age 15 to 19. Portugal looks the best, Iceland, Spain, Italy, UK and Italy look about average, not terrific, about average. There's the UK and Italy. There's the US. Looks terrible on this measure of young people's well-being. Really terrible. So the future is looking bleak. As I say, it's looking about average for the United Kingdom and Italy. You know, all right, but not terrific. And one of my arguments is that the mind is an important gateway by which social determinants affect health. We have effects on mental illness and well-being, and psychosocial pathways to physical illness through behaviors and, of course, through stress pathways. These deaths of despair that Anne Case and Angus Deaton referred to in the United States, we've had them in Glasgow in Scotland for a very long time. Researchers looked at mortality in Glasgow compared with Liverpool and Manchester, 3 post-industrial cities, similar levels of poverty and inequality. But mortality is higher in Glasgow. And the causes: drug-related poisonings, alcohol, suicide, and external causes, accidents and violence. The same deaths of despair that the Trump voters were dying of in the United States. And we have them in Glasgow. Sir Harry Burns, former Chief Medical Officer of Scotland, says psychosocially determined, low sense of control, self-efficacy, and self-esteem. And as you heard from Giuseppe Costa in the introduction, I chaired the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health, and in the wake of that did the English review, the so-called Marmot review, which we called Fair Society, Healthy Lives. And I had 6 domains of recommendations in my English review. Give every child the best start in life, education and lifelong learning, employment and working conditions. Number 4 is really radical. In a rich society, everyone should have at least the minimum income necessary for a healthy life. I know it sounds radical, but I think people should have enough money to buy food and shelter to be able to support their families. Number 5, and I'll talk quite a lot about number 5 now, is healthy and sustainable environment, and that relates to cities and micro areas. And number 6, taking a social determinants approach to prevention. So starting at the beginning, the life course. Give every child the best start in life. We've been monitoring health and social determinants of health, a set of, forgive me, Marmot indicators, looking at my recommendations. And here we've got the percent of children age 5 with a good level of development for each local authority in the country. So it's getting down to the local level. And what you see is, oops, I didn't mean to do that. What you see is the lower the deprivation, the more affluent the area, the higher the proportion of children age 5 that have a good level of development. That's the average. Actually, look at the red dots. The red dots are poor children. We have a means-tested benefit called free school meals. And to be eligible for free school meals, it's a means-tested benefit, so you've got to be below a poverty level. And I confidently predicted that poor children would do worse in poor areas. I predicted it confidently, and I was 100% wrong. Poor children do better in poor areas. The poorer the area, the higher the proportion of the poor children who have a good level of development age 5. And once we started to look at it, it's pretty clear. In a poor area, there's a lot of poor children. So the job is to focus on poor children. In a rich area, there are very few poor children. You can ignore them. And they do ignore them. And they do poorly. And that's got a very good message. If you focus on the problem, you can make a difference. Hey, that's terrific. That's better than rocket science. Focusing on the problem, you can make a difference. Wow. And the other part of early child development is adverse child experiences, ACEs, adverse child experiences. Incarceration, drug abuse, sexual abuse. And what we find is that each of these adverse child experiences follows the social gradient. The greater the deprivation, the greater the frequency of incarceration, drug abuse, sexual abuse, alcohol abuse, domestic violence, physical abuse, mental illness, verbal abuse, and parental separation. And if we look at the long-term impact of these adverse child experiences, it's quite profound. Early sex before the age of 16 could be reduced by 1/3 if we could theoretically abolish adverse child experiences. This is the impact of having 4 adverse child experiences or more. We could potentially abolish early sex before the age of 16 by 1/3, unintended teen pregnancy by 38%, smoking by 6%, binge drinking by 15%, cannabis use by... I was showing this slide to students, and they thought the top row was terrific. Early sex, cannabis, binge drinking, that's fun. It's great fun. Well, yeah, more of it. I said, but look, the bottom line's not so much fun. Half the victims, half the perpetrators of domestic violence had 4 or more adverse child experiences. And even more chilling, half the victims of domestic violence had 4 or more adverse child experiences. That's not fun. You can see this cycling through the generations. Children who are abused, otherwise maltreated, grow up to be drug abusers, perpetrators of domestic violence, victims of domestic violence, having mental illness and having physical illness. I showed that there was a very clear link between deprivation and the percent of children age 5 with a good level of development. So one way to reduce the inequalities in early child development is to reduce child poverty. Denmark, 9% of children are growing up in households in poverty, where poverty is defined as less than 60% of median household income. Iceland, Norway, Finland, Korea, between 9 and 11%. The UK, 19%. Italy, 25%. The US, 29%, just below Mexico. And I say to my American colleagues, what are you doing? You live in a democracy. This must be the level of child poverty that you want. Otherwise, you'd elect a government that did something different. I said that, and then they elected Trump. Oh, my God. Can you do anything? Can the government do anything about child poverty? Well, yes, it can. In Finland, This is the difference between pre-tax and post-tax child poverty. Social transfers, tax and benefits. Finland reduced child poverty by 2/3, as does Iceland, Norway, Denmark, Ireland, Sweden. We don't do so badly in the UK. Italy, you choose not to use the tax and benefit system to reduce child poverty. And the US reduces child poverty by 18%, compared with 2/3 in Finland. It's a political choice. The Minister of Finance probably has a greater impact on inequalities in early child development than the Minister of Health, which means the Minister of Finance probably has a greater impact on health inequalities than does the Minister of Health. And that relates to ensuring a healthy standard of living. One of the reasons people go to work, I know this will be news to you, one of the reasons people go to work is to earn money. And the political rhetoric is that people are poor because they're lazy. They're poor because of bad choices. This is the distribution of poverty in Britain by whether people are in working households or workless households. More than half the people below the poverty line are in households where at least one adult is working. They are poor not because they're lazy, not because they're morally lacking. They're poor because they're lowly paid. That's why they're poor. The way local government is funded in Britain is a big grant from central government and then local taxes. Margaret Whitehead, Liverpool, chaired this report. If you look at mortality by local area, the higher the mortality, the greater the cut in local government funding. And of course, this mortality is highly correlated with deprivation. What it means is the poorer the area, the greater the cut in local government funding. What the government said was poor areas are going to be cut. Rich areas won't be cut. And middle areas will be cut a bit, but not as much as poor areas. We will have a policy to increase inequality. We'll cut services to the areas that need them most. I don't think you have to be party political to say that's wrong. You have to care about health equity. And we should be looking at all policy decisions for their likely impact on health equity. This is a bad one. We know that housing matters for health. Least deprived area, most deprived area, the proportion of people living in housing with at least one problem. The more deprived the area, the higher the proportion of people living in households with 3 or more problems or 2 problems. You've read in your newspapers about Grenfell. We had the Grenfell fire. Grenfell was this high-rise local housing in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea in London. I've been to a dinner at the Thai ambassador's residence in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. I could have walked from this beautiful part of London, maybe half an hour to get to North Kensington, where Grenfell Tower is, in the same London borough. The life expectancy for men in the area around Grenfell was 14 years shorter than in the area where the ambassadors live. 14-year gap within one London borough. And not surprisingly, the building that went up in flames with tragic loss of life was in the deprived part of the borough with housing problems. Green space is good for our health. Who knew? What they've done here is look at the social gradient in deaths from circulatory disease. So look at the group that has least access to green space. And the income group, the top income group, is taken as one. So the second income group has a 30% higher death rate from cardiovascular disease. The third income group, the lower, has a 70% higher, and the bottom income group, a relative risk of 2.2, 120% higher. So that's in people who have little access to green space. You've got this steep social gradient by income in mortality from cardiovascular disease. Now look at the group with middle access. These are relative differences. The bottom group has maybe twofold higher risk. Now look at the group with most access to green space. Wow. The bottom group now, it's still a gradient, but it's more like 1.5. The more access to green space, the shallower the social gradient in mortality from cardiovascular disease. Exercising in green space is good for physical health and it's good for mental health. And of course, the more deprived the area, the lower the proportion of people who visited the natural environment in the last 7 days. So we deprive people of housing quality, we deprive people of access to green space, natural environment, and that makes a contribution to increasing the inequalities. And then air pollution. Looking at overcrowded households as a marker of deprivation. The higher the percent of households that are overcrowded, the higher the deprivation. The higher the deprivation, the higher the air pollution levels. And in fact, the Mayor of London now has a clean air strategy for London. Very important. And if we look, I told you before about free school meals as being a measure of poverty. If we look at schools, the percent of children eligible for free school meals, so the higher the percent of children eligible for free school meals, the greater the poverty. And high levels of nitrogen dioxide pollution, the greater the poverty level, the higher the exposure to air pollution. So we put our children into schools, and the poorer the family from which they come, the greater the level of air pollution to which they're exposed. That's not good. And percent of homes not meeting decent home standards by region and tenure. Interestingly, the private rental sector has worse quality than social housing in every region of the country. That's not good either. In principle, it shouldn't matter whether housing is private rental or social housing, but private rentals are increasingly unaffordable and worse quality. So we've moved from large-scale social housing dramatically into the private rental sector with more expensive housing of lower quality. And the proportion of people reporting low mental well-being in good and bad housing for working age adults and for pensioners, if they're in bad housing, then they're more likely to report low well-being. Housing matters. Green space matters. Air pollution matters. I said that we want to take a social determinants approach to prevention. Everybody's concerned about obesity, particularly childhood obesity. This is children aged 10 to 11 looking at obesity by level of deprivation. A remarkable social gradient. The more deprived the area, the more likely are children aged 10 to 11 to be obese. Now, each of those histograms shows us what's happening over time. So if we look from 2006-7 to 2012-13, the rise in childhood obesity for the most affluent children has stopped. And the next 10% is not really going up. But the more deprived the area, the steeper the rise in childhood obesity. So the inequalities in childhood obesity are getting bigger. And given that childhood obesity tends to track into adult obesity, that means the inequalities in obesity in the future are getting bigger. One contributor, of course, is fast food. This is the density of fast food outlets by deprivation of the area. The more deprived the area, the greater the density of fast food outlets, McDonald's, Burger King, KFC, and Pizza Hut. It's enough to give you indigestion just looking at the list. Oh, look at the author of the paper, McDonald. So access to fast foods and availability of fast food outlets is related to childhood obesity. This is the greater the number of fast food outlets and the percent of 10 to 11-year-olds overweight and obese. So availability of fast food is related to childhood obesity, but deprivation of area has a strong relation to childhood obesity independent of availability of fast food outlets. It's not only the availability of fast food. Deprivation leading to adverse child experiences has an impact on childhood obesity. I've said somewhat melodramatically, if we want to solve the obesity problem, we have to solve the inequality problem. I said that my message to doctors was, what good does it do to treat people and send them back to the conditions that made them sick? I spent a year as president of the World Medical Association, and that's really odd. And this is not false modesty on my part, but I've spent my whole life saying the key determinants of health are not what doctors do for patients. They're the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. And then they made me president of the World Medical Association, talking to doctors. Well, my mission for the year was evidence-based policy, presented in a spirit of social justice. I reminded the medical associations, we said on the cover of the WHO report of social determinants of health that social injustice is killing on a grand scale. And the mission for my presidency and for my life was health equity through action on the social determinants of health. I was invited to Australia to give some radio lectures for the ABC, which is the Australian version of the BBC, the national broadcaster. And the Australian Medical Association wrote to me and said, "We heard you're coming. Can we help you while you're here?" And I said, "I'd like to see doctors in action on the social determinants of health." Well, in Australia, they're very concerned about the gap, the health gap, between Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders, Indigenous Australians, and non-Indigenous. The latest figures, the life expectancy gap, 10.6 years for men and 9.4 years for women. When I arrived, journalists asked me, "We've spent billions of dollars trying to close this gap, and it hasn't worked. What should we be doing?" I said, "I've just arrived. I'm jet lagged. Give me another 24 hours. I'll tell you tomorrow." Well, the Australian Medical Association people took me to an Aboriginal community centre. So now we're getting into local action, micro areas. An Aboriginal community centre, 50 kilometres south of Sydney, the Tharawal Community Corporation. I was shown around by two Aboriginal women who are administrators at the centre. They have doctors there, specialists. The popular belly cast program. Aboriginal women don't attend antenatal care. The way they encouraged them to come to antenatal care was to take plaster casts of their pregnant torsos and then decorate with Aboriginal art. Absolutely lovely. Absolutely lovely. And the women love it. They're celebrating pregnancy and they have a real incentive to come. So educational gatherings before pregnancy, during pregnancy and after birth, pregnancy and postnatal care. So the women are encouraged to come in and be part of the system and get medical advice and good health advice and the like. They have legal services, a Department of Housing, disability support and the like. And the children. When I was there, the little children were just going down for their afternoon siesta. And I talked to gorgeous, all children are gorgeous, they're just lovely children. And I talked to the young woman who was looking after that part of the centre. I said, "How do you know if these children are developing well?" And she took a stack of forms off the shelf, one for each child, with 30 indicators of cognitive development, linguistic development, social, emotional, behavioral development. So where did you get these from? She said, "From the local university." So they're up to the minute in looking at the evidence on how well these kids are doing. Every family attends one of these programs. These are well-evaluated programs to improve the quality of parenting and improve early child development. I went to the drug and alcohol part of this campus, and I said to the Aboriginal woman who was in charge of this part, I said, "You must have the most difficult job in this whole centre." And she said, "No, I have the most rewarding job in this whole centre." And she took me over and showed me an Aboriginal painting on the wall. And she said, "The man who did this painting, when he came to us, he had all the problems of drugs and alcohol and domestic violence. And we helped him put his life back together. And he did this painting and brought it back as a gift to say thank you. I have the most rewarding job in this centre," she said. Subsidized fruit and vegetables, programs for the older people. You probably can't see that. Grannies against removal. So grandmas against removal. Leave our children with us. I talked to a child psychologist at the centre, and she said she was dealing with the consequences for children of being removed from their parents and the psychological consequences for the parents. And then she gave me the answer to the journalist's question on arrival. We've spent billions of dollars. How come we haven't closed the gap? She said, if systematically for 200 years you deprive a people of control over their lives, of the ability to live a life of dignity, it's hardly surprising that simply spending money doesn't close the health gap. I was on an ABC public affairs program. I won't go into the details now, but I talked about a fairer distribution of income between countries and within countries. And somebody else on the program, listening to me, said, "You're in fantasy land. You're in fantasy land. That's never going to happen." And the next day was when I went to the Tharawal Community Centre, Aboriginal Community Centre, and one of the doctors greeted me with a sign. So I say to you, colleagues, come into my fantasy land and let's dream together of creating a more just world.